What if some of 1975's biggest movie disappointments were not bad films at all, but movies audiences simply were not ready to understand? While Jaws dominated theaters, stranger and riskier pictures were ignored, badly marketed, or pushed aside. Some were genuine box office failures, while others simply fell far below expectations. Decades later, midnight crowds, collectors, critics, and filmmakers brought many of them back. Here are 35 1975 films that refuse to stay forgotten. Before we begin, hit like, share this video with another classic movie fan, and subscribe to the channel for more forgotten cinema. Number 35. Welcome Home Brother Charles, 1975. Few films on this countdown demonstrate the freedom of independent 70s filmmaking better than this strange revenge fantasy. Director Jama Fanaka created a movie that blends social anger, satire, street-level drama, and surreal exploitation into something mainstream theaters were never prepared to sell. The story follows Charles, a black man whose encounter with corrupt authority leaves him humiliated and determined to take control of his life. What begins like a rough urban drama gradually becomes increasingly unbelievable on purpose. Fanaka pushes the revenge film formula into wild fantasy, using exaggerated scenes to turn Charles into an almost mythic figure. The movie's most famous moments are also the hardest to describe without spoiling the joke, because the filmmakers deliberately give Charles an impossible physical ability that becomes part of his retaliation. Audiences looking for polished studio entertainment were unlikely to know what to make of it, and the film remained mostly in underground circulation. Yet that obscurity helped create its later reputation. Cult viewers began appreciating how fearless and handmade it felt. Today it plays less like a failed attempt at normal commercial cinema, and more like a filmmaker rejecting normal commercial cinema completely. Number 34. The Noah, 1975. Imagine a post-apocalyptic film with almost no ruined cities, armies, monsters, or futuristic machines. Instead, one lonely man becomes the entire spectacle. The story follows Noah, a soldier who appears to be the final survivor after global destruction, and finds himself stranded on an isolated island. At first he tries to establish routine, gather supplies, and behave like survival is simply another military assignment. Then the silence begins changing him. Noah invents imaginary companions, argues with people who do not exist, and slowly creates an entire social world inside his mind. One of the movie's most memorable passages comes when those invisible companions stop feeling imaginary even to the audience. Empty spaces suddenly seem crowded because Noah reacts to voices and personalities we can never see. That minimalist concept made the film extremely difficult to market, and its release was so limited that for years it felt more like a rumor among science fiction collectors. Yet viewers who eventually found it discovered something unusually thoughtful. Instead of asking whether humanity can rebuild civilization, the movie asks whether a single human mind can survive without civilization at all. Its commercial disappearance became part of its cult identity, and the film now feels like a forgotten experiment that arrived years before minimalist apocalypse stories became fashionable. If you enjoy finding movies that disappeared before they had a fair chance, subscribe now because the strangest titles are still ahead. And share this video with someone who thinks 1975 cinema began and ended with Jaws. Number 33. Darktown Strutters, 1975. Nothing about this movie behaves normally, which is exactly why it developed an underground following. The story begins with Cyrena, the leader of a motorcycle gang called the Darktown Strutters, searching for her missing mother. That sounds like the beginning of a straightforward urban action story, but the film immediately starts mixing genres. Biker comedy becomes musical satire, crime becomes science fiction parody, and every new character seems to have walked in from a different movie. The investigation eventually leads toward a bizarre conspiracy involving a powerful businessman and a plan that pushes the picture into deliberate absurdity. Some of the most memorable scenes combine motorcycles, bright costumes, musical numbers, exaggerated villains, and jokes aimed at stereotypes from older American entertainment. Mainstream audiences did not turn it into a hit, and critics often seemed uncertain whether the chaos was clever, offensive, or simply impossible to categorize. That confusion probably hurt it commercially. Years later, however, cult film lovers began responding to the exact things that had once made it difficult to sell. Directors and collectors championed its energy, its refusal to be respectable, and its unpredictable shifts in tone. Watching it today feels like entering a time capsule from a moment when low-budget filmmakers could throw every idea they had onto the screen and worry about categories later. Number 32. Poor Pretty Eddie, 1975. A road trip turns into a nightmare of isolation, when singer Liz Weatherly becomes stranded in a remote southern town. She takes shelter at a rundown lodge run by Bertha, a former entertainer, whose younger companion Eddie dreams of becoming a country star. At first, the situation seems merely uncomfortable. Eddie is pushy, the locals are intrusive, and everyone appears far too interested in the visitor. Then Liz realizes that leaving may not be as easy as arriving. The film builds its tension through a community that protects its own rules, even when those rules become cruel. One of the most remembered scenes places Eddie in front of local residents as he performs with complete confidence, while Liz watches the same room from a position of growing fear. The cheerful music and the threatening atmosphere clash in a way that makes the moment far more unsettling than a conventional chase. With limited distribution and a tone that mixed Southern Gothic drama, social commentary, and exploitation cinema, the picture never became a major commercial attraction. Later audiences rediscovered it through home video and cult screenings. What once looked rough and excessive began to feel like part of its identity. The movie's real horror comes from watching respectability and entertainment used as masks for a town that has decided an outsider's voice does not matter. Number 31. The Black Bird, 1975. Hollywood had a clever idea: take the mythology of the Maltese Falcon and hand it to a new generation as comedy. The result was much stranger than the studio probably expected. George Segal plays Sam Spade Jr., the son of the legendary detective, who inherits the famous black statue, along with a collection of problems attached to it. Criminals, mysterious women, and suspicious strangers appear almost immediately, all convinced that the bird must still hide a secret worth chasing. The joke is that Sam does not behave like Humphrey Bogart. He is trapped inside the machinery of a classic noir story, without possessing the romantic aura that made those old detectives seem invincible. One memorable sequence piles misunderstanding upon misunderstanding, as characters treat the statue like a sacred object, while Sam increasingly realizes he has inherited somebody else's legend rather than a useful treasure. Audiences in 1975 were caught between generations. Younger moviegoers did not necessarily care about a parody of a 1941 classic, while older viewers could easily prefer the original. The film faded quickly, yet its later appeal comes from the same awkward collision. Decades before Hollywood became obsessed with legacy sequels and inherited franchises, The Black Bird was already making jokes about what happens when a famous cinematic story refuses to stay finished. Number 30. Black Moon, 1975. Surrealism rarely promises easy box office success, and Louis Malle's Black Moon seems almost designed to frustrate anyone demanding a clear explanation. A young woman named Lily flees a mysterious conflict between men and women and arrives at an isolated estate where normal reality appears to have broken down. An elderly woman communicates through strange devices. Children behave as if they belong to a private kingdom. Animals seem capable of conversation, and a unicorn wanders through the landscape as naturally as a horse. The movie never pauses to explain which images are literal and which are symbolic. One of its most famous moments comes when Lily follows the unicorn, turning what might have been a simple fantasy image into a doorway toward an increasingly dreamlike world. For audiences expecting a conventional story, the experience could feel intentionally difficult. That made the film a poor candidate for broad commercial success, especially in a year when large-scale entertainment was changing the box office. Yet later art house audiences became more comfortable with its refusal to provide answers. Instead of treating every strange image as a puzzle with one solution, viewers began reading the film as a nightmare about conflict, sexuality, childhood, and identity. Its failure to explain itself became its greatest strength. Black Moon survived because no two people seemed to leave it with exactly the same interpretation. Number 29. Thundercrack, 1975. Some movies are rejected by the mainstream because they fail to follow the rules. This one seems to have been created by people who never accepted the rules existed. A group of travelers is caught in a violent storm and seeks shelter inside a gloomy old house, occupied by the unforgettable Mrs. Hammond. From that simple setup, the movie explodes into camp melodrama, absurd comedy, horror parody, counterculture theater, and material aimed squarely at adult underground audiences. The opening already announces its intentions. Rain pounds outside, while Mrs. Hammond prepares herself for unexpected guests with exaggerated seriousness, turning domestic routine into grotesque performance. As more strangers enter the house, secrets emerge, and the night becomes increasingly chaotic. No conventional distributor could have expected something this long, explicit, theatrical, and deliberately outrageous to play like a normal commercial feature. Its limited underground life meant it never competed with mainstream hits in any realistic sense. Yet that was also why it endured. Cult audiences later celebrated the handmade sets, exaggerated acting, and sensed that every performer had permission to push the movie further. Underneath all the provocation is a surprisingly affectionate attitude toward outsiders and people who do not fit respectable social categories. Thundercrack became a cult object because it feels less like a product and more like a private midnight performance that somehow escaped onto film. Number 28. The Romantic Englishwoman, 1975. A marriage becomes a psychological maze in Joseph Losey's cool, elegant drama. Glenda Jackson plays Elizabeth, the wife of successful novelist Lewis Fielding, portrayed by Michael Caine. Restless with her life, Elizabeth travels alone and encounters Thomas, a mysterious younger man played by Helmut Berger. Their meeting seems casual at first, but when Thomas later enters the couple's orbit, Lewis begins imagining possibilities faster than he can verify them. The clever part is that Lewis is a writer, which means he cannot stop turning real people into characters. Every glance becomes evidence. Every silence becomes a possible betrayal. One of the movie's strongest scenes has Lewis observing Elizabeth and Thomas, while mentally constructing a drama that may say more about his own fear than their actual relationship. Audiences expecting a passionate romantic triangle found something far colder and more intellectual. The film studies jealousy rather than simply dramatizing it, and that distance limited its popular appeal. Over time, however, viewers began appreciating how accurately it captures the danger of interpreting your own life like fiction. Caine's performance is especially fascinating because his charm gradually hardens into insecurity. What looked emotionally remote in 1975 now feels intentional. The movie understands that suspicion can become addictive, especially when an intelligent person is talented enough to invent convincing evidence for whatever he already fears. Number 27. Bug, 1975. A crack opens in the earth after an earthquake, and something small crawls out. That premise sounds like classic monster movie material, but Bug turns its threat into something much more intimate. The creatures are unusual insects capable of generating intense heat, allowing them to ignite objects around them. Scientist James Parmenter becomes fascinated by the species and begins studying its strange biology. His curiosity soon becomes dangerous when experimentation produces consequences he cannot control. The film's best scenes take everyday spaces and make them threatening. A car, a telephone, a kitchen, or a quiet room can become dangerous simply because one insect has hidden nearby. Instead of showing a giant creature destroying a city, the movie makes the audience scan the frame for something tiny. That concept gave Bug an effective hook, but it did not turn the film into a major sensation. By 1975, horror was changing rapidly, and an old-fashioned creature feature could seem trapped between earlier Atomic Age movies and the harsher horror trends of the decade. Later practical effects fans rediscovered its charm. Real insects, physical sets, and small bursts of controlled chaos give the picture a tactile quality that digital effects cannot imitate. It may be uneven, but Bug has the confidence to take one absurd idea completely seriously, and cult cinema often rewards exactly that kind of commitment. Number 26. The Story of Adele H., 1975. Not every commercial disappointment needs monsters, car chases, or outrageous advertising. François Truffaut created something far quieter with this historical drama about Adele Hugo, daughter of the famous writer Victor Hugo. Isabelle Adjani plays Adele as a young woman consumed by her love for British officer Albert Pinson. She follows him across countries, writes letters, invents stories about their relationship, and slowly allows desire to replace reality. The most powerful scenes are often the least dramatic on paper. Adele walks through busy streets while the world continues around her, yet her attention remains fixed on a man who has already emotionally left the relationship. Adami's face makes those moments devastating because hope and delusion appear at the same time. The film earned major critical respect, but its restrained style and melancholy subject were never designed to produce blockbuster business. What gave it a lasting reputation was Adjani's performance and Truffaut's refusal to romanticize obsession. The movie does not tell viewers that suffering proves the depth of love. It shows how dangerous love becomes when another human being is transformed into an idea that cannot be surrendered. Later cinephiles embraced it as one of the decade's finest character studies, proving that a film can have a modest theatrical life and still become essential through reputation alone. Number 25. The Reincarnation of Peter Proud, 1975. A recurring dream becomes evidence of another life in this eerie supernatural mystery. Peter Proud is a college professor who wakes night after night from visions he cannot explain. He sees unfamiliar streets, a woman he does not know, and a man dying in water. At first, Peter assumes the images are simply nightmares. Then television footage unexpectedly shows him a town he recognizes from those dreams. Curiosity becomes obsession, and he travels there searching for proof that the places in his mind exist. What he discovers is even stranger. The man from the visions appears to have been real, and Peter may somehow carry memories from that man's life. The investigation leads him toward Marcia, the dead man's widow, and Anne, her daughter, creating a relationship that becomes increasingly uncomfortable as the past and present overlap. Water is the movie's most effective visual symbol. Swimming pools and reflections repeatedly return Peter to the moment that seems to have ended his previous existence. One scene in particular places him near the same kind of water from his dreams, making the audience feel that history is waiting for him to repeat it. The film received only limited theatrical attention and never became the supernatural phenomenon its premise might have supported. Television and home video later changed its fortunes. Viewers fascinated by reincarnation stories kept finding it, and its unsettling questions proved stronger than its original marketing. The real mystery is not simply whether Peter lived before, it is whether discovering a former identity would make your current life richer or destroy the person you thought you were. Number 24. Lucky Lady, 1975. Everything about this production looked expensive enough to guarantee attention. Gene Hackman, Liza Minnelli, and Burt Reynolds were major stars. Stanley Donen had decades of directing experience, and the Prohibition-era setting promised romance, comedy, crime, and spectacle. Yet the finished movie became a classic example of how enormous ingredients can produce uncertain results. Claire, Kibbe, and Walker become partners in rum running along the California and Mexican coasts, smuggling alcohol while competing with criminals and avoiding authorities. Their business arrangement is complicated by romantic rivalry, because the two men are drawn toward Claire, and none of the three is particularly good at separating emotion from profit. The most memorable material comes when the movie abandons intimate comedy and turns into full-scale maritime action. Boats race across the water, gunfire erupts, and carefully built period machinery reminds viewers exactly how ambitious the production was. That shift also explains part of the problem. Audiences could never be sure whether they were watching a screwball romance, gangster comedy, action-adventure, or nostalgic period piece. Its grosses were not microscopic, but the costs and expectations were high enough that the film became associated with disappointment. The decades later, the pressure of being a prestige release has disappeared. Modern viewers can simply enjoy three charismatic performers competing for control of a deliberately old-fashioned movie. Its unevenness is obvious, but so is its craftsmanship. Lucky Lady is the kind of costly Hollywood swing that studios rarely make now, oversized, eccentric, and built around the belief that movie stars alone could hold several genres together. Number 23. The Hindenburg, 1975. By the middle of the 70s, disaster movies were reliable attractions, so an expensive recreation of the Hindenburg tragedy seemed almost guaranteed to work. Director Robert Wise approached the story as both historical spectacle and suspense thriller. George C. Scott plays Colonel Franz Ritter, a security officer assigned to the famous German airship after warnings suggest someone may attempt sabotage. While passengers socialize in luxurious cabins above the Atlantic, Ritter quietly investigates political enemies, suspicious crew members, private grudges, and possible conspirators. The audience faces a strange kind of suspense, because everyone already knows the airship will not complete its journey safely. That knowledge hangs over even casual conversations. The movie's defining sequence arrives when the Hindenburg reaches Lakehurst. Wise shifts the visual style and begins blending dramatic recreation with genuine historical footage. Suddenly, the polished period adventure collides with images viewers recognize from newsreels and documentaries. The effect is chilling, because fiction seems to surrender to history. The film made money at the ticket window in raw terms, but its large production cost and marketing expectations prevented it from becoming the kind of runaway disaster hit the studio wanted. Critics were mixed, and the picture slowly slipped behind better-known 70s spectacles. Later fans of practical effects and disaster cinema returned to it. The enormous interiors, miniature work, period detail, and patient build-up now have an appeal that modern digital spectacle sometimes lacks. The most interesting choice is that the film never pretends history can be defeated. Every clue and every investigation still moves toward the same terrible image waiting at the end. Number 22. The Killer Elite, 1975. Sam Peckinpah, James Caan, and Robert Duvall should have created one of the decade's defining action thrillers. Instead, The Killer Elite became one of those fascinating films that admirers debate precisely because it does not fit comfortably beside the director's biggest achievements. Khan plays Mike Lockin, an operative working for a private intelligence company. During an assignment, his trusted partner George Hansen suddenly betrays him, leaving Lockin seriously injured and forcing him into a long physical recovery. Rather than turning that recovery into a quick montage, the film allows us to watch his frustration. He struggles to walk properly, trains his damaged body, and rebuilds himself with the stubbornness of someone who wants revenge almost as badly as he wants independence. When Lockin is eventually hired to protect an Asian political figure, he realizes the assignment may also place Hansen within reach. The later shipyard confrontation is pure Peckinpah: divided loyalties, sudden action, martial arts fighters, gunmen, and professionals discovering that the organizations paying them may be less trustworthy than their official enemies. Audiences expecting the emotional force of the Wild Bunch, or the tension of Straw Dogs, did not turn this into a comparable hit. Its reputation remained modest for years, yet cult viewers now find plenty to admire, especially Khan's battered performance and Peckinpah's cynical view of private power. The espionage plot almost becomes secondary. What matters is watching men trained to follow orders slowly realize that loyalty is simply another product their employers buy and discard whenever convenient. Number 21. The Fortune, 1975. A movie featuring Warren Beatty, Jack Nicholson, Stockard Channing, and director Mike Nichols sounds like a guaranteed event. In 1975, that collection of talent instead produced one of Hollywood's most famous examples of a prestige comedy that audiences simply did not embrace. Set during the 1920s, the story follows Nicky and Oscar, two schemers attempting to gain access to the wealth of heiress Freddie. Legal complications prevent Nicky from simply traveling with her, so Oscar becomes part of a ridiculous arrangement intended to keep everyone technically respectable. Naturally, the plan grows more complicated the longer it continues. The men begin seeing Freddie less as a person and more as a fortune they deserve, while Freddie repeatedly proves that she understands their weaknesses better than they understand hers. One of the funniest sections involves a supposedly clever nighttime scheme that begins falling apart around a bridge, turning criminal intention into clumsy physical comedy. Nichols plays much of the movie like an old screwball farce filmed with new Hollywood stars. That stylistic experiment confused audiences who expected Nicholson and Beatty to project the cool confidence that had made them famous. Here they are petty, foolish, desperate, and frequently ridiculous. The movie's initial reception was harsh enough that it quickly became associated with failure. Later reassessments have been kinder, particularly toward Channing's performance. She is not simply the object of the men's plan. She is often the sharpest person in the room. Seen today, the movie feels less like a failed star vehicle and more like a deliberate attempt to make major stars surrender their dignity for comedy. Number 20. Rancho Deluxe, 1975. The Western was supposed to involve horses, dusty streets, gunfighters, and legends about the frontier. Rancho Deluxe looks at modern Montana and asks what happens when the descendants of that mythology are mostly bored. Jeff Bridges plays Jack McKee, while Sam Waterston plays Cecil Coulson. Together, they steal cattle from wealthy rancher John Brown, not because they are building a criminal empire, but because rustling gives their restless lives a sense of purpose. Brown becomes increasingly frustrated and hires aging investigator Henry Beige, played by Slim Pickens, to identify the thieves. The movie's humor comes from treating modern ranch life as a worn-out version of the heroic West. Jack and Cecil move through open landscapes with the relaxed attitude of young men who have inherited freedom without inheriting a cause. One memorable scene has the pair discussing their crimes with almost no urgency, as if stealing livestock is just another recreational activity. That laid-back rhythm made the film difficult to advertise. It was too modern to satisfy viewers wanting a traditional Western, too Western for people seeking a conventional youth comedy, and too strange to behave like a straightforward crime picture. Its initial theatrical impact was limited. Over time, however, Bridges' easy performance, Thomas McGuane's script, and the Montana setting developed a dedicated following. Jimmy Buffett's musical contribution added another layer of 70s personality. Today, the movie feels like a missing link between classical westerns and later stories about aimless American outsiders. It understands that once the frontier is gone, some people will keep performing the old rebellion simply because they have no idea what else to do. Number 19. Doc Savage, The Man of Bronze, 1975. Long before superhero franchises became Hollywood's safest business model, producer George Powell tried to launch one around a pulp hero created decades earlier. Ron Ely plays Clark Doc Savage Jr., an adventurer so strong, intelligent, disciplined, and morally perfect that the film almost has to treat him as a joke. After learning that his father has died under mysterious circumstances, Doc gathers his remarkable team and follows the clues toward the fictional Republic of Hidalgo. There he encounters a villainous plot involving hidden wealth, unusual technology, and enemies determined to stop him from discovering the truth. The movie constantly shifts between sincere adventure and deliberate camp. Doc enters scenes with heroic music and glowing confidence, while supporting characters use gadgets and exaggerated dialogue that make the story feel like a 1930s serial, reconstructed by filmmakers who had watched the colorful Batman television series. The ending even behaves like the opening chapter of a franchise, confidently suggesting more adventures will follow. They did not. Audiences showed little enthusiasm, critical reaction was weak, and the hoped-for series ended before it truly began. That failure gave the movie a different kind of afterlife. Pulp collectors, superhero historians, and lovers of strange studio experiments kept it alive. Seen now, Doc Savage is fascinating because it represents a future Hollywood almost reached too early. The basic ingredients of modern superhero cinema are present: an established character, a team, gadgets, exotic villains, franchise ambitions, and recognizable mythology. The difference is that 1975 audiences were not yet trained to treat those ingredients as automatic blockbuster material. Number 18. The Iger Sanction, 1975. Clint Eastwood did not need a digital mountain because the filmmakers had a real one. That fact alone gives the Iger Sanction an intensity that has helped it survive beyond its uneven original reception. Eastwood plays Jonathan Hemlock, an art professor and expert climber who once performed assassinations for a secretive organization. He wants to remain retired, but his employers pressure him back into service after the death of an old friend. The target is believed to be one member of a climbing team preparing to ascend the dangerous north face of the Eiger in Switzerland. The problem is that Hemlock does not know which climber he is supposed to eliminate. But before reaching the mountain, he trains in the American desert, producing several spectacular sequences where the camera emphasizes genuine height rather than studio illusion. The Eiger climb itself becomes the film's reason for existing. Wind, ice, rock, exhaustion, and physical risk make the suspense feel immediate. Eastwood performed significant climbing work, and the production itself faced real danger. Financially, the film was not a total disaster, but its expensive production meant the box office return looked modest beside expectations for an Eastwood vehicle. Critical reaction was also mixed, particularly toward the plot and some dated humor. Cult appreciation grew from the climbing material. Outdoor enthusiasts and action fans began treating it as a rare example of a major star placing himself inside environments that could not be easily controlled. Every time Hemlock looks down, the audience is not merely imagining the danger. The landscape is real, and that authenticity gives the movie a value impossible to reproduce with safer methods. Number 17. The Man Who Would Be King, 1975. Two former soldiers decide they are clever enough to conquer a country, and for a while the world appears willing to prove them right. John Huston's adaptation of Rudyard Kipling stars Sean Connery as Daniel Dravote and Michael Caine as Peachy Carnahan, adventurers who leave British India with an outrageous plan. They will travel into remote Kafiristan, use their military knowledge to organize local fighters, defeat rival groups, and eventually establish themselves as rulers. What begins as a confidence scheme grows into something almost mythical. During battle, an arrow seems to strike Daniel without harming him. The locals interpret the event as proof that he is divine. Instead of correcting them, Daniel accepts the advantage, and soon he is treated not merely as a king, but as a god. The film's tragedy begins when Daniel starts believing the role. Connery captures the transformation beautifully. The amused soldier slowly becomes a man convinced that history has personally selected him. The famous bridge sequence near the ending delivers the consequence with unforgettable simplicity. Commercially, the film did not become the enormous hit its stars, locations, and adventure scale might have suggested. Yet its reputation grew year after year. Connery and Caine's chemistry became legendary, while Huston's mixture of humor, spectacle, friendship, and imperial criticism aged remarkably well. Modern audiences can enjoy the adventure while also seeing the arrogance beneath it. Daniel and Peachy believe intelligence gives them the right to manipulate another society. Their real mistake is not that the plan fails. It is that success lasts long enough to convince them they deserve it. Number 16. The Drowning Pool, 1975. Nearly a decade after Paul Newman first played private investigator Lou Harper, the character returned in a film far darker and sweatier than the original. Harper travels to Louisiana after receiving a request from Iris Devereaux, a former lover who is being blackmailed. Her wealthy family is surrounded by secrets, resentments, and financial pressure, while powerful business interests are eager to control valuable property. What begins as a personal favor expands into a tangled investigation involving corruption, betrayal, and people who assume money gives them the right to control every outcome. Newman plays Harper with less glamour than many screen detectives. He is clever, but he is also tired, vulnerable, and repeatedly forced into situations where intelligence alone cannot protect him. The title becomes frighteningly literal during the movie's best-known sequence. Harper and Mavis are trapped inside an abandoned hydrotherapy room as water begins filling the enclosed space. There is no easy doorway and no heroic rescue waiting outside. Harper has to examine the room, improvise, and work against the rising water before time disappears. The sequence is simple, physical, and extremely effective. The movie never became one of Newman's signature hits, and for years it remained buried beneath his more famous work. Later, neo-noir fans began appreciating its Louisiana atmosphere, Gordon Willis's shadowy photography, and the way the plot replaces romantic detective mythology with 70s exhaustion. Harper may solve pieces of the case, but he never controls the world around him. That makes The Drowning Pool feel less like a traditional sequel and more like a detective story, discovering that the old rules no longer work. Number 15. The Stepford Wives, 1975. Some movies become larger than their original box office numbers because their title enters everyday language. The Stepford Wives did exactly that. Catherine Ross plays Joanna Eberhardt, a photographer who leaves New York City with her husband Walter and their children for the quiet Connecticut suburb of Stepford. The streets are clean, the houses are beautiful, and almost every family appears comfortable. Yet Joanna quickly notices something disturbing about the women around her. They are endlessly cheerful, perfectly dressed, obsessed with housework, and strangely uninterested in the ambitions or independence they might once have possessed. Joanna befriends Bobby, another newcomer who also finds Stepford suspicious, and together, they begin asking what happened to the lively women who supposedly lived there before. The movie's power comes from how slowly ordinary domestic perfection becomes frightening. One famous stretch shows women discussing cleaning and household products with unnatural enthusiasm, while Joanna watches them as if they are speaking another language. Eventually, the mystery surrounding the Stepford Men's Association reveals a plan to replace complicated, independent wives with manufactured versions designed to please their husbands. The final supermarket sequence is chilling, precisely because nothing looks chaotic. The women move calmly through the aisles, smiling and shopping, while the audience understands what has been taken from them. The film was not a giant commercial phenomenon on release, and contemporary responses were divided, especially over its relationship to feminism. Time strengthened it enormously. The phrase Stepford wife became cultural shorthand for artificial domestic perfection, inspiring sequels, television versions, a remake, essays, and endless references. A movie does not need to win its opening weekend when its central idea becomes part of the language. The Stepford Wives achieved something more durable than a temporary hit. It gave audiences a metaphor they are still using decades later. Number 14. The Great Waldo Pepper, 1975. Robert Redford was at the height of his star power, but The Great Waldo Pepper refused to give audiences the easy, heroic adventure its advertising might have suggested. Redford plays Waldo Pepper, a former pilot living in the years after World War I. He never achieved the combat glory he wanted, so he spends his time barnstorming across America, performing dangerous aerial tricks before crowds hungry for excitement. Waldo loves flying, but he also loves the legend of himself. He repeatedly tells stories about encounters with famous German ace Ernst Kessler, turning the war experience he missed into part of his public identity. At first, the film feels light and nostalgic. Small towns gather, airplanes buzz over fields, and pilots compete to see who can perform the most impressive stunt. Then, a performance involving young wing walker Mary Beth goes terribly wrong. What began as entertainment becomes a desperate attempt to save someone in front of spectators who suddenly understand how real the danger has always been. That sequence changes the entire movie. Waldo's romantic idea of aviation can no longer hide the cost. Later, Hollywood enters the story, using old pilots to recreate war battles for cameras. Waldo finally encounters Kessler, and the two men take part in an aerial duel that begins as staged entertainment but gradually becomes something private and almost spiritual. The film earned respectable money, so calling it an outright bomb would exaggerate the case, but it did not become the giant Redford event its scale and star suggested. Its cult reputation grew particularly among aviation enthusiasts. Real airplanes, practical stunt work, and wide skies give the flying scenes an authenticity that remains breathtaking. Underneath the spectacle is a sadder story about men who cannot stop chasing a heroic age that may never have existed the way they remember it. Number 13. The Devil's Reign, 1975. Few horror movies could assemble Ernest Borgnine, William Shatner, Tom Skerritt, Ida Lupino, Keenan Wynn, and a young John Travolta, and still emerge as a strange cult curiosity. The Devil's Reign manages exactly that. The story centers on the Preston family and an old conflict with a mysterious satanic leader named Jonathan Corbis, played by Borgnine. Corbis believes the family possesses a book containing names and souls promised to his group centuries earlier. When members of the Preston family begin disappearing, Mark Preston travels into an abandoned desert town to confront him. The setting does much of the work. Empty streets, harsh sunlight, and a church occupied by silent followers create an atmosphere that feels isolated from ordinary America. The movie's most famous material arrives near the end, when the title becomes literal and the followers begin melting under supernatural forces. The effects are prolonged, messy, and almost proudly excessive, giving horror fans the practical spectacle they remember long after the plot becomes fuzzy. Contemporary audiences and critics were far less enthusiastic. The film earned a reputation for confusion and sensationalism, rather than becoming a mainstream horror success. But cult cinema has always been generous toward committed weirdness. Later viewers returned for Borgnine's enormous performance, Shatner's intensity, the desert imagery, Travolta's early appearance, and the outrageous finale. The production also benefited from the involvement of technical advisor Anton LaVey, which gave its publicity an extra layer of forbidden mystique. Today, nobody approaches The Devil's Reign expecting subtle psychological horror. They watch because it is a pure 70s artifact. Serious actors, supernatural mythology, practical effects, and a finale determined to make the audience stare at the screen and ask how anyone thought of it. Number 12. Coonskin, 1975. Ralph Bakshi had already proven that animation did not have to be polite, family-friendly, or comfortable. Coonskin pushed that argument much further and immediately paid a commercial price. The film combines live-action framing scenes with animated stories about Brother Rabbit, Brother Bear, and Preacher Fox, characters inspired partly by old American folklore, but placed inside a violent satire of modern Harlem. Bakshi uses exaggerated imagery to attack racism, organized crime, corrupt authority, entertainment stereotypes, and institutions that profit from black communities while pretending to protect them. The visual strategy was intentionally dangerous. Instead of avoiding racist caricatures from earlier American cartoons, Bakshi drags those images onto the screen and twists them into weapons against the culture that created them. Not everyone accepted the distinction. Protests surrounded the film, its original distribution became chaotic, and many theaters never had a meaningful chance to show it. That damaged any possibility of a normal commercial life. One of its most striking sequences turns familiar national symbols into grotesque figures, creating a nightmare version of American mythology, rather than a realistic street scene. The movie constantly challenges the viewer to decide whether an image is exposing prejudice or simply repeating it. That debate never disappeared. For years, Coonskin was easier to hear arguments about than actually see. Underground screenings and later home video circulation allowed animation fans to reassess it outside the original controversy. Some still reject its methods, while others consider it one of Bakshi's boldest works. What cannot be denied is its refusal to treat animation as a safe space. In 1975, animated features were expected to obey certain commercial boundaries. Coonskin behaved as if those boundaries were invitations. Its cult status comes from that danger. The film remains difficult, confrontational, and impossible to reduce to a comfortable message. Number 11. At Long Last Love, 1975. Few directors have gone from critical favorite to public punching bag as quickly as Peter Bogdanovich did when At Long Last Love arrived. Only a few years earlier, films such as The Last Picture Show and Paper Moon had made him one of the most celebrated filmmakers of the new Hollywood generation. Then he attempted something completely different, a glamorous 1930s-style musical built around Cole Porter songs, starring Burt Reynolds, Sybil Shepherd, Madeline Kahn, and Duilio Del Prete. The plot is intentionally lightweight. Wealthy romantics meet, change partners, become jealous, misunderstand one another, and use music as an extension of conversation. Bogdanovich made the risky decision to capture many vocal performances live during filming instead of relying entirely on perfectly polished studio playback. That choice gives the numbers spontaneity, but it also exposes every limitation in the performers' voices. One memorable sequence follows Reynolds singing and moving through a scene with the confidence of a man who knows charm must carry him where technical perfection cannot. Critics attacked the film, audiences stayed away, and its low domestic gross quickly turned the title into shorthand for Hollywood overconfidence. For years, the accepted story was simple. Bogdanovich had become too powerful and made an embarrassing vanity project. Later critics complicated that story. Reappraisals praised the long takes, live performances, stylized artificiality, and willingness to make contemporary stars behave like performers from another era. The movie remains divisive, and that is more interesting than pretending everyone now loves it. Cult status does not require universal agreement. Sometimes it means a film survives long enough for a new audience to discover that the qualities once called mistakes may have been deliberate artistic choices. At long last, love went from career disaster to serious object of debate, which is an extraordinary second life for any supposed failure. Number 10. Listomania, 1975. Ken Russell looked at the respectable idea of a Franz Liszt biography and apparently decided respectability was the problem. Roger Daltrey plays Liszt, not as a quiet 19th century composer, but as a screaming celebrity whose fans behave like modern rock audiences. Women chase him, rivals resent him, music becomes spectacle, and historical figures are transformed into exaggerated symbols. Richard Wagner appears not simply as another composer, but as a threatening figure whose ambitions grow into wild political fantasy. Ringo Starr turns up as the Pope. Costumes become outrageous, props become deliberately excessive, and classical compositions are rearranged with the energy of glam rock. One of the movie's most famous stretches turns Liszt's celebrity and romantic reputation into enormous visual jokes that refuse subtlety at every opportunity. Another transforms musical rivalry into imagery so ridiculous that the film seems to be daring viewers to complain about historical accuracy. In 1975, plenty of them did. The movie's theatrical performance failed to match its noise, and many critics treated Russell's excess as evidence that the project had gone completely out of control. Yet cult audiences eventually recognized that control was not really the goal. Russell was making a movie about fame, ego, fandom, art, politics, and celebrity mythology, using the language of pop culture rather than traditional biography. Seen decades later, that approach feels surprisingly modern. Liszt is treated like an influencer, rock idol, brand, and public fantasy long before those categories dominated entertainment. The movie suggests that 19th century celebrity culture was not as different from modern celebrity culture as respectable history likes to pretend. Beneath all the madness is a sharp idea. Every era creates stars, sells personalities, invents scandals, and turns artists into symbols larger than their work. Listomania simply refuses to hide that process behind tasteful costumes. Number 9. Switchblade Sisters, 1975. Before Quentin Tarantino helped introduce it to a new generation, Switchblade Sisters was a low-budget gang picture that had slipped into the margins of 70s film history. Director Jack Hill centers the story on the Dagger Debs, a teenage girl gang connected to the male Silver Daggers. Lace is the established leader, but the balance changes when tough newcomer Maggie arrives. Friendship forms between the two women, yet jealousy, loyalty, rival gangs, and manipulation gradually pull the group apart. Patch, named for the patch covering one eye, becomes especially important as resentment turns her into a source of division. The movie takes school corridors, juvenile detention, neighborhood streets, and abandoned spaces, and treats them like battlefields in an exaggerated urban mythology. Its famous scenes are not famous because they are realistic. They are remembered because Hill commits completely to the attitude. Matching jackets, confrontations, sudden reversals, bold dialogue, and young women who refuse to function merely as accessories to male gangsters. Original theatrical business was limited, and the film might easily have remained just another exploitation title circulating on worn prints. Tarantino's public enthusiasm changed the conversation. A later re-release through his Rolling Thunder Pictures label helped critics and younger viewers recognize the movie as a major cult object rather than disposable grindhouse product. What makes it endure is the strange combination of rough filmmaking and clear character dynamics. Maggie and Lace are not simply tough poses. Their friendship gives the story something emotionally recognizable beneath the sensational packaging. The film also demonstrates a basic cult cinema truth. Sometimes a movie disappears because the original marketplace has no category for it, then returns when a later generation realizes that refusing the category was exactly what made it exciting. Number 8. A Boy and His Dog, 1975. Long before post-apocalyptic wastelands became a familiar setting for major franchises and video games, a young Don Johnson wandered across one with a sarcastic, telepathic dog. Vic is a survivor in a future devastated by war. Civilization on the surface has collapsed into scattered communities, scavengers, dangerous strangers, and people searching ruins for whatever still has value. His closest companion is Blood, an intelligent dog who communicates directly with him and often appears far more sensible than the human being he protects. Their relationship gives the film its personality. Blood helps Vic locate food and detect danger, while constantly criticizing his impulsive behavior. Then Vic meets Quilla June, a mysterious young woman who leads him toward an underground society called Topeka. The change in visual style is unforgettable. After the dusty openness of the wasteland, Topeka presents artificial small-town America, painted faces, neat clothing, marching band cheerfulness, committees, rules, and smiles that look more disturbing the longer they remain fixed. Vic initially thinks he has discovered comfort, only to learn that the underground community has its own plans for him. The film was produced independently on a small budget and never received the sort of wide release that could create blockbuster numbers. Its afterlife was far larger. Science fiction viewers discovered it through repertory theaters, television, and home video, while later post-apocalyptic stories made its influence easier to recognize. The controversial final joke remains one of cult cinema's most discussed endings because it refuses to soften Vic's brutal survival logic. Whether viewers laugh, recoil, or both, the scene makes the movie impossible to forget. A boy and his dog survived because its future is not sleek or heroic. It is dirty, ridiculous, cynical, and populated by people who rebuilt society without necessarily becoming better human beings. Number 7. Smile, 1975. A teenage beauty pageant becomes a perfect target for American satire in Michael Ritchie's Smile. The setting is the fictional Young American Miss competition in California, where contestants are expected to represent talent, optimism, discipline, and wholesome values. Around them, however, adults turn the event into a machine of ambition, local pride, advertising, insecurity, and quiet desperation. Bruce Dern plays Big Bob Freelander, an enthusiastic businessman and head judge who sincerely believes in the pageant, even as its contradictions become impossible to ignore. Barbara Feldon plays Brenda DiCarlo, the organizer trying to keep rehearsals, judges, contestants, parents, and sponsors under control. The funniest scenes often involve rehearsal rooms where teenagers practice smiling, walking, speaking, and performing, while adults argue about rules that supposedly measure character. Ritchie never needs a giant villain because the system itself becomes the joke. Everyone wants the contest to look innocent, yet almost everyone has a selfish reason for needing it to succeed. One memorable sequence follows contestants performing carefully prepared routines while the camera catches uncomfortable reactions from the people evaluating them. The girls are told to appear natural, after spending days being instructed exactly how to stand, speak, and smile. Critics often admired the movie, but ticket buyers did not turn it into a success. Its theatrical failure became more surprising as the years passed. Reality television, influencer competitions, talent shows, and personal branding made Smile feel increasingly prophetic. Later cult viewers recognized that the film was not really making fun of teenage contestants. Its target was the adult culture surrounding them, a culture obsessed with packaging personality into something attractive enough to judge. The title becomes the perfect command. Whatever pressure, disappointment, or absurdity is happening behind the scenes, face the audience and smile. Number 6. The Day of the Locust, 1975. Hollywood almost never spends this much money, showing Hollywood as a place capable of destroying the people who worship it. John Schlesinger's adaptation of Nathaniel West's novel follows Todd Hackett, a young artist working in the movie industry during the 1930s. Todd becomes fascinated by Faye Greener, an aspiring actress played by Karen Black, but her dream of stardom is only one among many desperate hopes surrounding him. Failed entertainers, lonely spectators, underpaid workers, odd performers, opportunists, and people who moved west expecting cinema to transform their lives crowd the edges of the story. Donald Sutherland gives one of the film's strangest performances as Homer Simpson, a painfully withdrawn man whose emotional need makes him vulnerable to people far more confident than he is. The movie deliberately refuses the glamorous rhythm expected from a Hollywood story. Sets look cheap when viewed from behind. Actors wait for work, parties feel desperate, and fantasy is always one doorway away from disappointment. Then comes the unforgettable premiere sequence. Crowds gather outside a theater hoping to glimpse stars, but excitement slowly becomes frustration and panic. The scene erupts into chaos as celebrity worship, anger, fantasy, and violence merge into a nightmare. Todd imagines images resembling the apocalyptic painting he has been creating, as if the entire dream factory is finally revealing the destruction hidden beneath its bright signs. The production was expensive, the tone was bleak, and audiences stayed away. It became one of the period's more notorious prestige disappointments. Decades later, that commercial failure seems almost appropriate. The Day of the Locust was attacking the exact fantasy used to sell movies. Modern viewers watching crowds chase celebrity access, online fame, and proximity to entertainment culture may find the film even more uncomfortable now. Its message is not that Hollywood dreams are foolish, it is that an industry selling dreams can become dangerous when millions of people are taught that ordinary life is not enough. Number 5. The Ultimate Warrior, 1975. Yul Brynner enters a ruined New York carrying almost nothing except confidence, physical skill, and the expression of a man who has already seen civilization fail. The Ultimate Warrior takes place in a future after social collapse has transformed the city into scattered enclaves competing for food and safety. One relatively organized community is led by the Baron, played by Max von Sydow, who has managed to protect seeds, supplies, and a small hope that agriculture might begin again. That hope makes the settlement valuable, and therefore vulnerable. Brynner plays Carson, a highly capable fighter, recruited to defend the group against a violent rival faction, led by Carrot. The story becomes more complicated when the Baron asks Carson to escort his pregnant daughter Melinda out of the city, carrying knowledge and resources that could help life continue elsewhere. The movie's standout material comes from its empty urban spaces. Streets that once represented modern power have become hunting grounds, and familiar structures now feel ancient. Rather than relying on futuristic technology, the film imagines a future where technology has largely disappeared and people return to knives, improvised defenses, rooftop gardens, and hand-to-hand survival. Its release failed to create the kind of commercial excitement that later post-apocalyptic pictures would enjoy, and for years, it remained far less famous than Brynner's westerns or science fiction work. Cult viewers eventually rediscovered its stripped-down atmosphere. The picture now looks like an early bridge between 70s collapse stories and the wasteland action movies that exploded in the following decade. What makes Carson interesting is his lack of speeches. He does not believe he can repair society. He simply recognizes that protecting a few seeds and one future child may matter more than winning another fight. That small scale gives the movie a seriousness hidden beneath its exploitation-style title. Number 4. Night Moves, 1975. Gene Hackman plays a private detective who can follow clues across the country, yet cannot understand what is happening inside his own marriage. That contradiction gives Arthur Penn's Night Moves its lasting power. Harry Mosby is hired by a former actress to locate her teenage daughter Deli, who has disappeared into a loose circle of relationships far from home. Harry tracks her to Florida, where she is staying around her stepfather and a group of people whose connections seem casual until hidden motives begin emerging. At the same time, Harry discovers that his wife is having an affair. The detective who professionally observes strangers becomes emotionally helpless when the mystery belongs to his own life. One of the movie's best-known conversations comes when Harry discusses seeing an Eric Rohmer film and compares the experience to watching paint dry. The line is funny, but it also reveals his personality. Harry wants action, answers, and conclusions. Night Moves gives him none of those comforts. The final sequence on the water is where the film becomes unforgettable. Smuggling, a plane, a boat, hidden evidence, and sudden danger finally reveal pieces of the conspiracy. Yet Harry understands the pattern too late to control it. The damaged boat begins circling in the water, carrying him around and around without progress. It is the perfect final image for a detective who has spent the entire story moving while remaining several steps behind. The original theatrical response was disappointing, but later critics elevated Night Moves into the first rank of 70s neo-noir. Hackman's performance now looks almost painfully modern. He is not cool enough to dominate every room or brilliant enough to solve life like a puzzle. He is simply a capable man discovering that the world contains more information than anyone can organize. The case ends, but clarity never arrives. Number 3. Barry Lyndon, 1975. Stanley Kubrick responded to the collapse of his planned Napoleon project by making another 18th-century epic, then photographing it with such extraordinary control that nearly every frame resembles a painting. Ryan O'Neal plays Redmond Barry, an Irish young man whose romantic disappointment sends him into a long journey through war, gambling, social climbing, marriage, wealth, and eventual decline. Barry repeatedly reinvents himself. He becomes a soldier, deserts, is forced into another army, enters gambling circles, meets aristocrats, and finally marries Lady Lyndon, gaining the status he has spent years pursuing. Yet the closer he gets to respectability, the more his weaknesses become visible. He spends recklessly, treats his stepson Lord Bullingdon with increasing hostility, and behaves as if entering the aristocracy means he can never be removed from it. The film's candlelit interiors became legendary because Kubrick and cinematographer John Alcott used specially adapted lenses to capture rooms illuminated largely by natural candlelight. The result is beautiful, but Kubrick never allows beauty to become warmth. People appear arranged inside elegant spaces, like figures trapped in paintings. The duel between Barry and Bullingdon is one of the movie's great sequences. It is slow, awkward, frightening, and almost completely opposite to the graceful duels audiences expect from costume adventures. Every missed shot creates more tension, because the characters have time to understand the consequences. Barry Lyndon cost a great deal, and did not become the enormous popular success expected after Kubrick's earlier films. Some viewers called it cold or painfully slow. Time reversed much of that judgment. Filmmakers, critics, photographers, and younger audiences now regularly celebrate it as one of cinema's visual landmarks. The irony is perfect. A movie about a man desperately chasing permanent status had to wait decades for its own status to become secure. Number 2. The Passenger, 1975. Jack Nicholson was becoming one of the biggest stars in American cinema when Michelangelo Antonioni gave him a role built around exhaustion, silence, and the desire to stop being himself. Nicholson plays David Locke, a television journalist working in North Africa. His assignments have left him frustrated and emotionally empty. When another guest named Robertson dies in the same remote hotel, Locke notices that the two men look similar enough for a reckless idea. He switches passport photographs, reports himself as the dead man, and walks away carrying Robertson's identity. For a brief moment, the escape feels almost magical. David Locke no longer has to answer David Locke's telephone, marriage, career, or obligations. Then he opens Robertson's appointment book. The man whose life he stole was involved in arms dealing, and strangers are waiting for meetings Locke does not understand. His attempt to escape one complicated existence has placed him inside another. Along the journey, he meets a mysterious young woman, played by Maria Schneider, and the pair drift across Europe, through hotels, roads, modern buildings, and landscapes that seem to emphasize how small they are. Antonioni refuses to turn the premise into a normal chase thriller. Suspense exists, but the deeper question is whether identity can ever be changed by paperwork. The final extended shot is one of the most famous in 70s cinema. The camera slowly leaves Locke's hotel room, passes through the barred window, moves across the square outside, observes ordinary activity, and eventually returns after something decisive has occurred. The protagonist almost disappears from his own conclusion. Initial commercial response was modest compared with Nicholson's mainstream hits, but cinephile admiration kept growing. Today, The Passenger is often treated as a masterpiece of alienation. Locke believes another name can free him, only to discover that the person he is trying hardest to escape may be the one person who follows everywhere. Number 1. The Rocky Horror Picture Show, 1975. No movie on this list better demonstrates how completely history can reverse a box office failure. When the Rocky Horror Picture Show first reached American theaters in 1975, the conventional release did not work. Audiences did not arrive in the numbers the studio expected. Screenings disappeared, and the film looked destined to become another strange musical experiment that would be remembered mainly by the people who made it. Then, midnight audiences changed everything. The story begins with Brad and Janet, a painfully respectable young couple whose car breaks down during a storm. Looking for help, they enter a nearby castle and discover that the people inside obey completely different rules. Their host is Dr. Frank N. Furter, played by Tim Curry, with the kind of confidence that instantly makes every other character appear ordinary. His entrance remains the defining scene. The elevator descends, the cape turns, Curry reveals the costume beneath it, and the movie suddenly belongs to him. From there, the plot becomes a collision of science fiction parody, horror references, rock musical, romantic confusion, comedy, and deliberate theatrical excess. Time warp became an audience ritual. Rocky's laboratory unveiling turned Frankenstein imagery into pop spectacle. Meatloaf's arrival as Eddie injected another burst of energy, while the floor show near the ending pushed the film fully into glittering fantasy. None of this rescued the original normal release. Midnight screenings did. Viewers began returning every week, dressing as characters, shouting replies at the screen, bringing props, and performing scenes below the projected movie. Watching Rocky Horror stopped being passive entertainment and became participation. The film that could not behave like a normal box office hit discovered a business model built on refusing normal behavior. Over decades, repeat engagements turned it into one of the most famous cult films ever made and gave it a theatrical life almost no conventional blockbuster could match. That is why it belongs at number 1. Other movies were rediscovered by critics or collectors. Rocky Horror built an audience that physically kept the film alive. Its first failure did not merely become success, it became tradition. So which forgotten 1975 disappointment deserved its second life the most? Barry Lyndon, Night Moves, Smile, or the unstoppable Rocky Horror Picture Show? Tell us your choice in the comments. If you enjoyed discovering movies that audiences missed before history gave them another chance, hit like, share this video with another classic cinema fan, and subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes, the biggest theatrical mistake becomes the movie nobody can kill.